4 continents in the corner, and Great Britain has been made much larger in scale.
When workers began routine maintenance inside Camilla's private estate, no one expected to stumble upon a hidden chamber sealed behind her son's bedroom wall. What they uncovered was no ordinary find. It was a secret that carried the weight of memory, grief, and unresolved history.
Well, there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded.
Within the dust and shadows lay something so personal, so haunting, that it reignited wounds thought long buried. But what could possibly emerge from the darkness that left even the royal family utterly speechless? This is that shocking discovery. The day routine became revelation. What began as a routine inspection at Camilla's secluded private estate quickly turned into a revelation that threatened to shake the monarchy to its core. The day had started quietly, with workers moving from room to room, assessing structural integrity, making notes, and tapping along walls for the faintest signs of damage. Their job was simple: check for cracks, leaks, and hidden weaknesses that might over time undermine the safety of the property. Yet none of them could have predicted what they were about to uncover in the most unlikely of places: the bedroom belonging to Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's eldest son. It began innocently enough. While surveying one of the walls, a worker's attention was caught by a faintly uneven line concealed beneath layers of plaster and hidden behind a decorative panel. At first glance, it seemed trivial, the sort of irregularity expected in older homes where time leaves its fingerprints in subtle cracks and fading paint. The assumption was that it was nothing more than the harmless scars of age. Yet something about this seam felt different, almost too deliberate, too carefully hidden. Curiosity led to a closer examination. When a hand knocked gently against the surface, the sound that echoed back was not solid stone or brick, but a strange, hollow vibration, as though the wall itself was concealing a space behind it. The workers exchanged uneasy glances. This was no ordinary blemish. Something lay concealed, deliberately tucked away in silence for decades. Protocol demanded that nothing further be disturbed until a higher authority could be consulted. Within minutes, estate security had been summoned, and soon after, palace officials arrived with strict instructions. The atmosphere shifted from casual inspection to tense urgency. Guards stationed themselves by the door, the workers stepped back, and the once ordinary bedroom seemed to transform into a stage where history itself was about to perform an unexpected act. Under careful supervision, the plaster around the irregular seam was chipped away. The room grew quiet, the air thick with anticipation. Each strike of the tool echoed like a drumbeat, as though the walls themselves resisted giving up their secret. And then, at last, the panel loosened and gave way, revealing the dark, dust-choked cavity hidden behind. What lay beyond was not the result of natural decay or forgotten renovations. This was no accident of time. It was something else entirely. A concealment executed with precision, buried with the intent to remain undiscovered. The space was narrow, claustrophobic, its stale air thick with the breath of decades long gone. Whoever had sealed it away had done so deliberately, ensuring that its contents would never meet the light of day without force. The officials peered into the opening, flashlights piercing the gloom, and the workers instinctively held their breath. They knew they had stumbled upon something extraordinary, something far beyond their original task. This was no mere hidden flaw of an old estate. This was a secret, purposefully entombed in stone and plaster, waiting, perhaps even daring, to be found. The discovery left everyone unsettled, for in that moment it became clear they were not just dealing with architecture or forgotten renovations. They were standing at the threshold of a mystery that carried the weight of intent, secrecy, and perhaps even scandal. A secret long hidden behind Tom's wall now threatens to break the monarchy's silence. But what kind of truth was so dangerous it had to be buried away for decades? Now, let's uncover how a hidden passage revealed a chest sealed with dangerous secrets. The corridor of silence. When the final fragments of plaster crumbled away, the sight that met their eyes sent a ripple of unease through the room. Behind the broken wall, hidden from view for decades, stretched a narrow corridor cloaked in dust and silence. The air that seeped out was heavy, stale, and suffocating, as though time itself had been trapped inside with no escape. Each step into that space felt less like a discovery and more like an intrusion into something deliberately meant to remain sealed away. This was no grand passageway designed for flight or safety, unlike the hidden routes often whispered about in royal history. There were no broad stone steps or elegant arches meant to carry kings and queens to safety. Instead, the corridor was cramped and suffocating, its walls pressing in with oppressive weight, forcing those who entered to move cautiously and with unease. It did not invite escape. It demanded silence. It was not a design of protection but of concealment. The deeper they pressed into the narrow channel, the more unsettling it became. The dust clung to their clothes and faces, cobwebs stretched across corners like veils of forgotten memories, and the faint scuttle of unseen insects echoed in the quiet. This was a place untouched by life for decades, perhaps longer, as though the world outside had moved forward while this chamber remained locked in a suspended, airless eternity. And then, at the farthest point of the corridor, the flashlight beams fell upon something that froze every breath in the air. There it stood. An iron-bound chest, squat and unyielding, its wood warped by time yet still solid, its blackened iron bands clinging to it with the strength of centuries. Dust coated its surface in thick layers, yet even beneath that cloak of age, the chest carried an aura of intent. It had not been left there casually, nor had it drifted into place by chance. Its position was too precise, perfectly centered within the alcove as though chosen deliberately, as though someone had placed it with care and purpose, ensuring it would remain until its time of discovery arrived. The lock, though rusted, still glinted faintly under the light, a quiet testament to its resilience. Whoever had secured this chest had wanted it sealed, had wanted it to endure. This was not clutter discarded by history. It was not some forgotten trunk abandoned in the chaos of renovation. This was an object hidden with determination, preserved with secrecy, and left with intent. The silence of the corridor seemed to grow louder, pressing on those who stood before the chest. The discovery did not feel like triumph, but intrusion, as though they had broken into a chamber where secrets had been deliberately laid to rest, and where even the air whispered warnings not to disturb what had been entombed. What secrets did this chest guard keep? Why had it been sealed so carefully, hidden so deeply, and left in a corridor designed not for escape, but for erasure? The questions swirled heavily in the minds of those present, each one more troubling than the last. This was no accident. This was a message, a burden from the past waiting, perhaps unwillingly, to be unearthed. The chest had not been waiting to be found. It had been waiting to be opened. But what lay inside? Was it jewels, forgotten heirlooms, or something far more powerful? Something that could change the future of the crown? Let's find out. When secrets replaced treasure. The air inside the narrow corridor had already been heavy with anticipation, but nothing compared to the silence that fell when the iron-bound chest was finally dragged into the open. Its weight alone suggested importance, its lock clinging with the determination of decades. As the final hinge groaned and the lid creaked upward, everyone in the room seemed to hold their breath. For a moment, there lingered the wild hope of jewels, gold, or priceless heirlooms. Treasures fit for a crown, relics of a monarchy that had always cloaked itself in wealth and ritual. But that hope was shattered in an instant. There were no sparkling jewels, crowns, or royal treasures to be found. Instead, nestled within the chest were stacks of papers, bound with faded ribbons whose colors had long turned to ghostly grays and pale blues. The parchment was fragile, yellowed with age, and the ink had seeped softly into the fibers. At first, the discovery seemed almost ordinary, mere scraps of paper where riches had been expected. But the moment the handwriting appeared, unmistakably personal and deliberate, the air shifted from casual curiosity to stunned disbelief. The penmanship was instantly recognizable. It was her hand, Diana's. These were not carefully chosen letters written for public release, nor the polished remarks she had once allowed to be aired in interviews. These were something else entirely: private journals, raw fragments of her unguarded truth. Each line pulsed with emotion, each page whispered with confessions never meant to be read by strangers. The words carried no filter, no performance. They were the pure outpourings of a woman who had felt unseen and unheard inside the gilded walls of royalty. The journals bled with honesty. There were passages filled with aching loneliness, words that painted vivid pictures of nights spent in silence where, even surrounded by grandeur, she felt invisible. Other entries crackled with frustration and quiet defiance, as though she was writing against a world that refused to acknowledge her pain. And woven through it all was the haunting fear that her story, her very voice, would one day be silenced completely. Buried beneath the weight of the crown and its relentless machinery of image and control. What made the discovery all the more devastating was the intimacy of the writing. These were not statements prepared for history books, nor legacies shaped for posterity. They were letters to herself, words intended to exist only within the safety of secrecy. Yet here they were, hidden behind a wall in Camilla's son's bedroom, waiting silently for decades until fate forced them back into the light. For those present, the realization was staggering. They were not handling artifacts of wealth, but fragments of a soul. Each ribbon-bound stack represented pieces of Diana herself, her voice, her pain, her truth. Resurrected in ink long after her passing, the air seemed charged with her presence, as though the room itself pulsed with the weight of what had been uncovered. This was no treasure of gold or jewels. This was far more dangerous, far more powerful. It was Diana's unfiltered voice, a voice that refused to be erased and one that threatened to reshape everything the monarchy thought it had buried. Why was this secret uncovered in Tom's bedroom? And who is he? Could it be that the secret was always meant to be revealed through words, and that the man best placed to carry it forward is the one whose life revolves around them? Now, let's delve into why Diana's words surfaced in the hands of Tom Parker Bowles. When fate chose a writer. What stunned both the palace and the public was not just the contents of the discovery, but its astonishing location. This revelation did not emerge from a secret royal archive or a long-forgotten chamber in a centuries-old palace. Instead, it was hidden in the most personal and unexpected of places, behind the bedroom wall of Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's eldest son. The intimacy of the setting made the find all the more shocking and profound. Tom has never carried the weight of royal titles, nor has he lived under the same suffocating glare of monarchy as William and Harry. He has remained an observer rather than a participant, tethered to the royal orbit through bloodlines and circumstance, but carving out his own life in a very different sphere. His identity has always been tied to words, not crowns, first as a journalist, later as a food critic and author, and always as a man who built his craft on language, and narrative. His career has been one of interpretation, of shaping truth into stories for the world to read. And perhaps that was the cruelest irony of all, striking with the force of lightning. Hidden within his own quarters, sealed behind layers of plaster and stone, lay words that defied expectation. These were not carefully edited articles or sentences crafted to satisfy an audience. No, these were the raw, unguarded words of Diana herself, a voice unfiltered, unshaped, and fearless. For years, her truth had been restrained, softened, and redirected by the weight of the institution around her. Yet now, it spoke freely, impossible to ignore. For years, Diana herself had expressed a deep fear that her story, her real story, would one day be softened into myth or erased by official narratives. She worried aloud that the memory of her vulnerabilities, her passion for the marginalized, and her struggles within the palace would be tidied into footnotes rather than preserved as they were truly lived. And now, decades later, her most private words, untouched and unshaped, had surfaced in the most unexpected hands, the son of the woman who replaced her in Charles's life. The twist was so striking, so laden with meaning, that few could accept it as mere coincidence. Diana's hidden voice did not surface in William's study, nor in Harry's distant refuge, but behind the walls of a man whose life revolved entirely around words and storytelling. Observers murmured that it was almost fate, as if destiny itself had ensured that her unfiltered truth would land in the hands of someone uniquely equipped to understand it, preserve it, and perhaps one day give it the life it deserved. For Tom, the discovery must have been disorienting. He had built a life separate from the royal machine, often resisting being defined by his connection to Camilla. Yet now, he found himself standing before the ghost of Diana, holding pages that could alter not just his own family's story, but the image of the monarchy itself. The symbolism was almost too perfect. Diana's voice, once muted by the crown, had risen in the quiet sanctuary of a writer. Tom Parker Bowles has become the unlikely keeper of a voice the palace once tried to silence. But what does this discovery truly mean for the monarchy? And how far will its echo reach? Now, let's unravel how Diana's words sparked panic, division, and reckoning. Whispers into wildfire, the revelation spread through the palace like a spark, catching dry kindling, igniting whispers that refused to be contained. What had begun as a quiet, almost accidental discovery now moved with the force of a storm through corridors that had long thrived on discretion and silence. The air within Buckingham Palace and beyond grew heavy with unease, for this was not simply another rumor or tabloid scandal that could be brushed aside with polished statements. This was different. This was tangible. This was Diana's own hand, her own voice, reaching across decades to remind the monarchy of a truth it had tried to bury. Courtiers, normally so measured and composed, began to murmur in hushed tones that carried an unusual urgency. Should the contents of the chest be disclosed, laid bare for the world to see in their raw and fragile honesty? Or should they be locked away again, destroyed if necessary, in the name of preserving the institution? The palace was no stranger to crisis management. Entire systems had been built to weather controversy, to shield the monarchy from the harshness of public scrutiny. But the discovery of Diana's private writings presented no easy solution. This was never gossip, nor idle speculation, and certainly not the distorted tales spun by eager journalists chasing headlines. These were Diana's own words, raw, unfiltered, and utterly undeniable. Within each page lay her deepest confessions, the crushing loneliness behind the public smile, the quiet fears of being forgotten, and the haunting certainty that her truth might one day be erased by the very institution she had devoted herself to. These writings were more than words. They were a heartbeat, a soul reaching across time to be heard. The implications shook the foundations of royal authority. Legal experts were called in to examine every possible angle. Could the writings be considered personal property of the late princess and therefore belong to her sons? Or had they become, by strange circumstance, part of the monarchy's archives, to be hidden, managed, or selectively shared at the discretion of the crown? There were no clear precedents, no simple answers. Every option carried risks, and each one seemed to pull the monarchy into deeper waters. Palace insiders murmured that King Charles carried the heaviest burden of all. This discovery struck him not merely as a challenge to the monarchy, but as a deeply personal confrontation with memory, raw, painful, and tangled. To witness his late wife's private words resurfacing from behind the walls of his current wife's eldest son's bedroom was nearly unbearable. It felt as if the past had barged into his present, refusing to be ignored, demanding attention, and shattering the fragile calm he had painstakingly tried to maintain for both himself and the crown. The monarchy had endured rumors before. It had survived endless speculation, harsh criticism, and scandals that seemed designed to test its resilience. Yet rumors could be denied, dismissed, or drowned out. What it could not easily silence were Diana's words written in her own hand. Words that struck with the force of truth. And now, those words had risen, not from archives or interviews, but from a hidden chamber in Camilla's son's private quarters. This revelation is a reckoning the monarchy cannot ignore. But how will William and Harry respond? Will they let it stay buried? Or will their actions give Diana's silenced voice the attention it demands? Now, let's explore how their divided grief awakened truths long hidden. Brothers divided, yet bound by Diana's voice. For Princes William and Harry, the hidden discovery was never about politics, palace rules, or public image. It struck far deeper, into the heart, the memories, and the wounds they carried. It was intensely personal, raw, and unbearably heavy. In that moment, the weight of history, secrecy, and loss collided, and all they felt was the sharp ache of grief. The moment they learned that the chest contained their mother's private writings, the air seemed to shift. These were not carefully drafted public letters or statements shaped for sympathy. They were Diana's most vulnerable words, raw and unguarded, pulled straight from the depths of her heart. For her sons, reading them felt like stepping into a time capsule of their mother's voice, honest, broken, hopeful, and afraid all at once. It was as if she had reached across time, speaking directly to them, bypassing the crown, the courtiers, and the history books. William, always cautious and protective of the monarchy's fragile reputation, immediately felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He worried that if these deeply personal confessions ever reached the press, they would not be respected as their mother's truth, but ripped apart for headlines, sensationalized until their meaning was lost. To him, restraint felt like protection, a shield not just for the monarchy, but for Diana's dignity. He wanted to preserve her voice, not watch it be shredded into tabloid spectacle. Harry, on the other hand, felt no such hesitation. Freed by distance, both literal and emotional, he was outraged. To him, the very fact that their mother's words had been hidden in Camilla's son's private quarters felt like betrayal, piled upon betrayal. Diana had feared her voice would be silenced, and now, decades later, here was proof. For Harry, there was no time for caution. He demanded immediate transparency, insisting that her truth should not be controlled, filtered, or contained by the very institution that had often tried to bury it. Though their grief brought William and Harry together in shared sorrow, their instincts collided with searing intensity. Long-buried wounds, shaped by contrasting roles, life choices, and perspectives, resurfaced with undeniable force. William, bound by the weight of duty as heir, approached with caution and care. Harry, the free-spirited spare, demanded openness and truth. Both sought to honor their mother's memory, yet their methods diverged completely, revealing a poignant tension between responsibility and rebellion, tradition and freedom, love and loss. To outsiders, the rift between William and Harry appeared unfixable, a chasm shaped by years of difference and diverging paths. Yet beneath the visible tension lay an undeniable reality, a bond forged by love and shared loss. Their mother's voice, once thought erased by time and circumstance, had resurfaced. Those long-hidden words now called out with urgency and clarity, insisting that they be acknowledged, understood, and never silenced again. No matter their differences, neither William nor Harry could allow those words to be buried again. For them, this was not about power or politics. It was about love, memory, and justice for the woman who had given them both life and purpose. And in that moment, even in division, they carried the same vow. Diana's voice would live on. William and Harry promised their mother's voice would never be buried. But beyond her words, what keeps Diana alive in the hearts of the world forever? Let's find out. A legacy that refused to stay buried. Diana's rediscovered journals did not simply add a few hidden pages to the royal record. They reopened a chapter the monarchy had worked for decades to carefully close. What emerged from behind the wall was not just paper, ink, and ribbons frayed with time, but a voice that once shook the world, and suddenly spoke again with startling clarity. For the royal family, it was not just a discovery, it was a reckoning. For years, Princess Diana had been remembered through images carefully preserved in public memory. The radiant humanitarian, the glamorous yet relatable princess, the woman who walked into AIDS wards when fear and stigma kept others away. She had been celebrated as a champion of the vulnerable, a mother whose devotion to William and Harry softened the harshness of royal protocol, and as a global icon who campaigned against landmines with unmatched courage. Her compassion defined her, her empathy reshaped how the monarchy was seen, and her charitable work inspired millions across continents. But these journals unveiled something deeper, the heart behind the public figure. The Diana who emerged in these pages was not only the charitable princess the cameras adored, but also a woman who struggled with fears, who wrestled with invisibility, and who questioned whether her truth would ever survive beyond the palace walls. In fragile handwriting, sometimes shaky, sometimes sharp, she admitted her greatest dread, that her legacy would be softened, reshaped, or silenced by the very institution that had so often failed to hear her. This was not the Diana of glossy magazines or carefully edited interviews. This was Diana as she saw herself, unguarded, raw, emotional, and utterly human. In one passage, she reflected on her work with children, not in the language of headlines, but in confessions about the pain she carried home afterward. In another, she questioned whether her efforts to challenge stigma, whether about AIDS, homelessness, or mental health, would ever outlast the narratives of palace scandal. What the world had seen as strength was here revealed as both triumph and burden, victories carved from loneliness and determination. And that is what made these journals so dangerous and so powerful. They gave Diana back her voice, not as a symbol created by others, but as a storyteller of her own life. Every faded ribbon that bound those pages seemed to unravel carefully crafted myths, reminding the world that Diana was not only a figure in history, but a woman who wanted to be remembered truthfully. For the royal family, this was the shock. Her voice had not vanished, nor could it be controlled. It had returned most unexpectedly, unearthed from behind the bedroom wall of Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's eldest son. The irony was impossible to ignore. A woman who feared her words would be hidden forever was now speaking again from a place so intimately tied to the woman long accused of overshadowing her memory. It was no wonder that the discovery left the palace reeling. These were not treasures that could be locked away, nor relics to be displayed. They were confessions alive with the power to change how Diana was remembered. Not as myth, not as memory, but as voice. A voice unyielding. A voice is undeniable. A voice impossible to silence again. And that, above all, is why what they found behind Camilla's son's bedroom wall did not merely surprise the royal family. It left them speechless. What do you think lies ahead for the monarchy now that Diana's voice rises? We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe.
When maintenance crews began their routine inspection inside Camilla's private estate, no one could have imagined stumbling upon a hidden chamber sealed behind the bedroom wall of her son. What they uncovered was no ordinary find. It was a secret that carried the weight of memory, grief, and unresolved history. Well, there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. Those words seemed to echo in the air, as though foreshadowing what lay waiting in the darkness. Within the dust and shadows rested something deeply personal, haunting enough to reopen wounds thought long buried. But what could possibly emerge from the silence, something so powerful that it left even the royal family utterly speechless? This was that shocking discovery. The day ordinary routine became extraordinary revelation. What began as a standard inspection at Camilla's secluded estate quickly transformed into a moment that threatened to shake the monarchy to its core. The morning had started quietly, with workers moving from room to room, assessing structural integrity, noting cracks, and tapping walls for faint signs of weakness. Their task was simple: search for flaws that might, over time, compromise the safety of the property. Yet not one of them could have predicted the secret they were about to uncover in the most unlikely of places, the bedroom of Tom Parker Bowles. Camilla's eldest son, it began innocently enough. While surveying one wall, a worker noticed a faintly uneven line, hidden beneath layers of plaster and camouflaged by a decorative panel. At first glance, it looked trivial, just the kind of imperfection one might expect in an aging estate, where time leaves subtle cracks and faded paint. The assumption was simple: harmless scars of age. But something about this seemed felt off. Too precise, too deliberate, too carefully disguised, curiosity turned into suspicion. When a worker knocked on the surface, the echo that returned was not the solid thud of stone or brick but a hollow vibration, as though the wall concealed a void behind it. Uneasy glances were exchanged. This was no ordinary blemish. Something lay hidden here, deliberately tucked away in silence for decades. Protocol required restraint. Nothing more could be disturbed until higher authorities arrived. Within minutes, estate security was summoned. Soon after, palace officials swept into the room with strict instructions. The atmosphere shifted instantly from casual inspection to urgent secrecy. Guards took positions at the door. The workers stepped back, watching as the once ordinary bedroom transformed into a stage, where history itself seemed ready to perform its next act. Under careful supervision, the plaster around the seam was chipped away. The room grew hushed. Each strike of the chisel echoed like a heartbeat, as though the walls resisted surrendering their secret. At last, the panel loosened and fell, revealing a dark, dust-choked cavity behind. What emerged was not the result of natural decay, nor some forgotten renovation. This was deliberate, a concealment crafted with precision, buried with intent to remain hidden forever. The narrow space was claustrophobic, its air stale with decades of silence. Whoever sealed it away had done so to ensure its contents would never meet the light of day unless forced. Flashlights pierced the gloom. The officials peered inside. The workers held their breath. They knew at once they had stumbled upon something extraordinary, something far beyond their original task. This was no flaw in the architecture. This was a secret entombed, deliberately waiting to be unearthed. And so the discovery left everyone unsettled. For in that instant it became clear this was not just about walls and plaster. This was about intent, secrecy, and perhaps even scandal. A secret buried behind Tom's wall now threatened to break the silence of the monarchy itself. But what kind of truth could be so dangerous it needed to be hidden away for decades? Now, let us uncover how a hidden passage revealed a chest sealed with dangerous secrets. The corridor of silence. When the last fragments of plaster crumbled, the sight before them sent ripples of unease through the room. Behind the broken wall stretched a narrow corridor, cloaked in dust and shadow. The air that seeped out was heavy, suffocating, as if time itself had been trapped inside. Each cautious step felt less like discovery and more like intrusion into something never meant to be disturbed. This was no grand escape passage. Unlike those whispered about in royal history, no broad stone steps or arches designed to save kings and queens in peril. No, this passage was cramped, suffocating, the walls pressing inward with oppressive weight. It invited no escape. It demanded silence. The deeper they pressed into the corridor, the more unsettling it became. Dust clung to clothes, cobwebs draped corners like veils of memory, and faint scuttles of insects echoed in the silence. This was a place untouched for decades. Perhaps longer, a chamber locked and suspended, airless eternity. And then, at the farthest end, their flashlights froze upon something that stole the breath from the room, an iron-bound chest, squat and unyielding. Its wood warped with age, its blackened bands clung stubbornly in place. Dust blanketed its surface, but even beneath that shroud, the chest radiated intent. It had not been abandoned. It had been placed there, deliberately positioned at the exact center of the alcove, as if waiting for its time of discovery. The rusted lock still glinted faintly in the light, a quiet testament to resilience. Whoever sealed this chest wanted it to remain sealed. This was no discarded clutter, no forgotten trunk. This was an object hidden with determination, preserved in secrecy, left with purpose. The silence pressed heavier. This did not feel like triumph. It felt like intrusion, as though they had trespassed into a chamber where secrets had been deliberately buried on, where even the air whispered warnings not to open what lay within. What secrets did this chest guard? Why had it been sealed so carefully? Why hidden in a corridor designed not for escape, but for erasure? The questions circled heavier than the air itself. This was no accident. This was a message from the past burden and truth waiting to be unearthed. The chest had not been waiting to be found. It had been waiting to be opened. But what lay inside? Jewels, heirlooms, or something far more dangerous, something capable of altering the very future of the crown? The answer was about to change everything when the chest was finally dragged into the open. The air grew dense with anticipation. Its weight alone screamed importance. The lock clung tightly, resisting, until at last the hinges groaned and the lid creaked upward. Everyone held their breath. For a moment, there lingered the hopeful fantasy of treasure's gold, crowns, relics of royal grandeur, but that illusion shattered instantly. Inside were no jewels, no crowns, no treasures fit for a monarchy. Instead, there lay stacks of papers, bound with faded ribbons of pale blues and grays. Fragile parchment, yellowed by time, its ink seeping into the fibers. At first glance, they seemed ordinary. Mere scraps of paper where riches had been expected. But then the handwriting appeared unmistakable. It was hers, Diana's, not the words polished for interviews, not the carefully chosen letters shaped for public release. No, these were something else entirely. Private journals, raw fragments of her unguarded truth. Each page bled with honesty. Each line whispered confessions never meant for strangers' eyes. These were not artifacts of wealth. They were fragments of a soul. The voice of a woman, unseen and unheard within the gilded cage of royalty. Loneliness seeped through her words. Nights of silence painted in vivid strokes. Frustrations crackled between the lines' quiet defiance against a world that refused to see her pain. And woven through it all was fear. Fear that her voice, her very story, would one day be silenced forever beneath the crushing weight of the crown. The intimacy was staggering. These were not legacies prepared for history. They were letters to herself, secrets intended never to leave the safety of her hands. Yet here they were, hidden in Camilla's son's bedroom wall, waiting in silence for decades, until fate demanded they return to the light. The realization struck hard. This was not treasure. This was truth. Diana's truth resurrected in ink long after her passing, and the monarchy would never be the same again. This was no treasure of gold or jewels. This was something far more dangerous, far more powerful. It was Diana's unfiltered voice of voice that refused to be erased, and one that threatened to reshape everything the monarchy had long tried to bury. But why was this secret uncovered in Tom's bedroom? And who exactly is he? Could it be that fate intended Diana's truth to be revealed through words, and that the man best suited to carry it forward was one whose very life revolved around them? Now, let's explore why Diana's words surfaced in the hands of Tom Parker. Bowles. When fate chose a writer. What stunned both the palace and the public was not only the contents of the discovery, but the shocking location itself. This revelation did not emerge from a royal archive, nor from some forgotten chamber in a centuries-old palace. Instead, it was unearthed in the most intimate and unlikely of places, sealed behind the bedroom wall of Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's eldest son. The intimacy of that setting made the discovery even more profound. Tom has never carried the burden of royal titles, nor has he lived under the suffocating spotlight that consumed William and Harry. He has always remained on the edge of the royal orbit, connected by bloodlines and circumstance, yet carving his own path in a very different world. His life has always been tied not to crowns, but to words, first as a journalist, then as a food critic and author, and always as a craftsman of language and narrative. His career has revolved around interpreting truths and shaping them into stories the world could read. And perhaps that was the cruelest irony of all, for hidden within his own quarters, sealed behind layers of plaster and stone, were words that no one could have expected. Diana's words, these were not carefully edited articles, nor phrases shaped to appease audiences. No, these were her raw, unfiltered, fearless confessions. For years, Diana's truth had been restrained, softened, or redirected by the institution around her. Yet now, through these pages, her voice spoke freely, once again impossible to ignore. During her lifetime, Diana often voiced her fear that her real story would be silenced, that her vulnerabilities, her passion for the marginalized, and her struggles within palace walls would be erased, reduced to neat footnotes in history books. And yet, decades later, her most private words, untouched and unshaped, surfaced in the most ironic of hands, the son of the woman who had replaced her. In Charles's life, the twist was too heavy with symbolism to dismiss as coincidence. Diana's hidden voice had not reappeared in William's study, nor in Harry's refuge abroad. It emerged instead from behind the wall of a man whose life was built entirely on words and storytelling. Observers whispered that it felt like fate, as if destiny had ensured her unfiltered truth would land in the hands of someone uniquely equipped to understand, preserve, and perhaps one day give it the life it deserved. For Tom, the discovery must have been disorienting. He had spent years distancing himself from royal politics, resisting any definition tethered solely to his mother's role. Yet suddenly, he stood before Diana's ghost, holding words that could alter not just his family's story, but the very image of the monarchy. The symbolism was undeniable. Diana's voice, once muted by the crown, had resurfaced within the quiet sanctuary of a writer. Tom Parker Bowles had become the unlikely keeper of the voice the palace once tried to silence. But what did this discovery mean for the monarchy? And how far would its echo reach? Now, let's unravel how Diana's words sparked panic, division, and reckoning. Whispers into wildfire, the revelations spread through the palace like a spark catching dry kindling. What began as a quiet, almost accidental discovery soon roared like a storm through corridors long used to silence. The air in Buckingham Palace grew heavier with unease, for this was no rumor, no tabloid scandal that could be dismissed with carefully written statements. This was different. This was tangible. This was Diana's voice, her hand, her words reaching across decades to remind the monarchy of a truth it had tried to bury. Courtiers, usually calm and composed, now whispered with unusual urgency, should the contents of the chest be revealed in their raw and fragile honesty? Or should they be locked away again, perhaps even destroyed, to preserve the institution? The palace had weathered crises before. Entire systems existed to shield the monarchy from scandal, to soften blows of public opinion. But Diana's writings offered no such escape. This was not gossip, not speculation, not the distorted tales of journalists. These were her words, unfiltered, undeniable. Every page pulsed with her deepest confessions. crushing loneliness behind the public smile, fears of being forgotten, and the haunting certainty that her truth would be erased by the crown. These writings were more than ink on parchment. They were her heartbeat, preserved across time. The implications rattled the monarchy's foundations. Legal experts were summoned to dissect every angle. Were the journals Diana's private property belonging to her sons? Or had they somehow become part of the monarchy's archives, to be controlled, hidden, or selectively shared at the crown's discretion? There were no clear answers. Every option carried danger, each one pulling the monarchy deeper into uncharted waters. For King Charles, the burden was heaviest. This was not only a challenge to the crown, but a personal confrontation with memory raw, painful, and unrelenting. The thought of his late wife's private words resurfacing from behind the walls of his current wife's eldest son's bedroom was almost unbearable. It felt like the past breaking into the present, demanding to be acknowledged and shattering the fragile calm he had tried so hard to preserve. The monarchy had survived endless speculation, harsh criticism, and scandal after scandal. Rumors could be denied, dismissed, or drowned out. But what could not be silenced were Diana's words, written in her own hand, carrying the weight of undeniable truth. And now, those words had emerged not from an archive, nor from her sons, but from a hidden chamber in Camilla's son's private quarters. The reckoning was unavoidable. But what of William and Harry? Would they allow this truth to remain buried again? Or would they take up their mother's voice and give it the attention it demanded? Now, let's explore how divided grief awakened truths long hidden. Brothers divided, yet bound by Diana's voice. For William and Harry, the discovery was never about politics, palace rules, or public perception. It struck deeper into their hearts, their memories, and their grief. It was raw. It was unbearable. When they learned the chest contained their mother's private writings, the world seemed to fall silent. These were not public letters, not carefully drafted statements. These were her most vulnerable confessions, words drawn straight from her soul for her sons. Reading them felt like stepping into a time capsule. Diana's voice alive once more. Honest, fractured, hopeful, afraid. It was as though she had reached across time, bypassing crowns, courtiers, and history books. Speaking only to them, William, cautious and protective, felt the crushing weight of responsibility immediately. He feared that if their mother's raw confessions ever reached the press, they would not be honored as truth. Instead, they would be sensationalized, torn apart, and stripped of dignity. For him, restraint felt like protection, a shield, not only for the monarchy, but for Diana herself. Harry felt no such restraint. Freed by distance and disillusionment, he was outraged. That his mother's voice had been hidden, buried in Camilla's son's private quarters, felt like betrayal upon betrayal. Diana had feared her truth would be silenced. And now, here was proof. To Harry, transparency was the only way forward. Her words must not be controlled by the same institution that had once sought to bury them. And so, their grief united them, yet their instincts clashed. William, bound by duty, sought caution and care. Harry, unshackled, demanded openness and truth. Both sought to honor Diana, but in starkly different ways. To the world, their rift seemed unbridgeable, a chasm carved by years of difference, widened by choices, and sharpened by distance. Yet beneath it all lay one unshakable bond: love for their mother. Her voice, once thought lost, had risen again. Those hidden words demanded to be heard, understood, and never silenced, no matter their divisions. Neither William nor Harry could allow that voice to be buried once more. For them, this was no longer about duty or politics. It was about love, memory, and justice for the woman who had given them life and purpose. And in that moment, even in division, they carried the same vow. Diana's voice would live on. William and Harry promised their mother's voice would never be buried. But beyond her words, what keeps Diana alive in the hearts of the world forever? A legacy that refused to stay buried. Diana's rediscovered journals did not simply add a few forgotten pages to royal history. They tore open a chapter the monarchy had spent decades trying to carefully close. What emerged from behind that wall was not just paper, not just ink, but the heartbeat of a woman who once shook the world and now spoke again with startling clarity for the royal family. It was not just a discovery, it was a reckoning. For years, Diana had been remembered through carefully curated images: the radiant humanitarian, the glamorous yet relatable princess, the mother whose love softened the harshness of royal life, the global icon who walked into AIDS wards and landmine fields when others stayed away. Her compassion defined her. Her empathy reshaped how the monarchy was seen. Her courage inspired millions across continents. But these journals revealed something deeper: the woman behind the myth. This was not the Diana of glossy magazines, not the edited voice of televised interviews. This was Diana, as she saw herself, unguarded, raw, emotional, and profoundly human. In fragile handwriting, sometimes shaky, sometimes sharp, she confessed her greatest dread that her truth would one day be erased or reshaped by the very institution that had so often refused to hear her. One passage recalled her visits with children, not in the polished language of headlines, but in whispered pain over the suffering she carried home afterward. Another questioned whether her battles against stigmatized homelessness, mental health would outlast the palace scandals that forever haunted her name. What the world saw as strength was here revealed as both triumph and burden. And that is why these journals were so dangerous and so powerful. They gave Diana back her voice, not as a symbol others created, but as a storyteller of her own life. Each faded ribbon and every page unraveled carefully built myths, reminding the world that Diana was not only history's princess, but a woman who wanted to be remembered truthfully. For the monarchy, the irony was impossible to ignore. A voice they tried to mute had re-emerged, not in William's study, not in Harry's refuge, but from behind the wall of Tom Parker Bowles, the son of the woman who replaced her. It was no wonder the discovery left the palace reeling. These were not artifacts to be hidden in vaults, not relics to be displayed. They were living confessions, alive with the power to reshape memory, to rewrite legacy, to make Diana impossible to silence again, not as myth, not as symbol, but as voice, a voice unyielding, a voice undeniable, a voice eternal. And that is why what they found behind Camilla's son's bedroom wall did not merely surprise the royal family, it left them speechless. What lies ahead for the monarchy, now that Diana's voice rises again? Share your thoughts below and don't forget to like and subscribe.